Prime Minister Marape recently issued a public statement clarifying that the Commission remains operational under caretaker leadership while an internal inquiry into its 3 senior commissioners, yourself included, is underway. He attributed the situation to the internal conflict within ICAC's leadership, saying that instead of working together to fight corruption, the commissioners were fighting amongst themselves. How do you respond to this claim, and what would you like the public to understand about the events that led to the current inquiry?
Look, for me, Laura, that's really disappointing. When I first, and I did read that media statement from the Prime Minister, I actually consider it quite slanderous and defamatory to myself personally.
Today on Coffee with Lewa, we are honoured to welcome a man who has dedicated his career to fighting corruption and protecting integrity in some of the toughest environments you could imagine. Dan Baulch is the Deputy Commissioner for Operations and Technical Services at the Independent Commission Against Corruption in Papua New Guinea. He brings with him over 2 decades of frontline and leadership experience from Victoria Police in Australia, where he led complex criminal and integrity investigations, followed by senior roles at WorkSafe Victoria and the Victorian Electoral Commission, holding powerful institutions accountable and ensuring that no one was above the law. Since joining ICAC PNG, Dan has been at the forefront of building an institution that many see as a beacon of hope for this country. He has spoken boldly in the face of pressure, defended the independence of the Commission, and stood with the next generation through initiatives like the Clean Generation movement, inspiring young Papua New Guineans to believe in an integrity-driven future. In a time when corruption is too often described as systematic and trust in governance feels fragile, leaders like Dan Baulch remind us that courage, integrity, and accountability are not optional. They are essential. Dan, we're so grateful to have you with us on Coffee with Lewa. Welcome.
Thank you, Laura.
We're going to start with some personal questions just to get to know you a little better and for our audience as well, and give you an opportunity to introduce yourself. Could you briefly walk us through your professional background from Victoria Police to your leadership at WorkSafe Victoria and how those experiences shaped your approach to governance and integrity?
Yeah, for sure. Look, it makes me feel old when I answer a question like this because I have to go back to the last millennia where I graduated the Police Academy in Victoria in 1999. Look, I knew it as something I always wanted to do as a career in policing, to the point I actually did my Bachelor of Arts in police studies prior to joining the police force. I just sort of thought it was really important to understand, what your role actually is. And it's having some really key concepts about having what people call legitimacy. And so legitimacy in policing and any sort of investigative body is really understanding that your legitimacy comes from the people, from the public and those that you serve. And these truly are roles of service. I sort of just naturally loved investigating. I have a deep dislike for those who commit crime and corruption. But more importantly, I'm a big fan of justice. And I think justice is really, really important. And it's distinct from, I suppose, what sometimes legal systems do deliver. As a result, I fell into work as a detective. I'm doing a lot of work in drugs, organised crime, and then corruption. I spent a lot of time working in sort of COVID areas as well too, where I'd focus on working with people in recruiting them to come and work for us and providing information or what they call informers or human sources in the policing sense. That stuff's really, really critical. So it's having a real understanding of what drives these sort of people, looking for their vulnerabilities and when they will basically turn or roll, as we'd say, and getting them on board is absolutely critical. And it's something that yields a lot of really good results in organised crime, but also corruption investigations. When you basically have people wondering who can I trust in my service. I progressed up through a lot of corruption work, had a bit of a, not a break, but I worked in the corporate side of policing in our risk and assurance area for Victoria Police, where I managed our risk management framework, which I reformed, and also did our audit co-source work with Ernst & Young, where we'd look at various audit projects, looking at wastage, performance phase and things of that nature, which then shaped me for my final role in policing, where I ended up heading up investigations for what's called the Professional Standards Command. There we look at police corruption and what sort of is going on amongst our ranks. And it's Not necessarily rampant Victoria Police, but it does happen, and there's a real nuance and difference between Victoria Police and what I see in Papua New Guinea. When I looked at corruption in a policing sense, we have a lot of really poor decisions, and I used to call it either dumb stuff or dodgy stuff is what we look at, and most stuff was really just dumb choices that our people made because they really didn't think about what their actions were. When you sort of flip side that with Papua New Guinea and what I've seen in the public service and across government and with politicians, it's definitely not dumb stuff. It is just outright dodgy stuff. And it's things we're looking to steal from the people. My time at WorkSafe was really interesting as well too. I sort of did a couple of those roles at the Victorian Electoral Commission and WorkSafe as transitionary roles to this role in Papua New Guinea. It was a really, really long recruitment. I suppose, headhunted more or less when the recruiter contacted me and said, would I consider putting in? To that point in time, I'd never really considered it. And then the more I went through the process and did my research and homework, the more and more I became really motivated towards the role. And that's what, caused me to say that I had my break from policing. I'd love the job, but I'd also been through some really, really challenging and difficult situations. One of the last things I attended was the fatal accident on the Eastern Freeway in Victoria where 4 of our police members were killed. It was the greatest loss of life in Victoria Police in the one incident. And walking through the scene of that event with the head of the Major Collision Investigation Unit, where 4 of our people had been killed, unfortunately, you just sort of come to the realisation of, well, how much more can I actually do this, or how much more do I want to do this, and do I need to change and a step away from that type of work? Having said that, I now confront that with my oldest daughter, who's now graduated from the Victoria Police Academy.
Wow.
So I'm very,
Congratulations.
very proud of her. Worry greatly. Even in recent weeks, we had unfortunately, the death of 2 other police members who were murdered in the Victorian High Country. So it does cause me concern. Love the time at WorkSafe because, again, and the Electoral Commission, because in both those roles, you can work in a role where you're really working at constructive compliance and working with the people that you also regulate, because quite often you'll have a lot of shared goals and values. At WorkSafe, it was protecting the safety of workers and making sure that those that didn't value their safety were made accountable. The Electoral Commission, voting and democracy is one of the most crucial things. And I was brought on before the 2022 state election, about 7 or 8 months out, with a really urgent piece of work around looking at political donations and making sure that people complied and just basically run a fair election and making those accountable that didn't follow that fair process. It's so critical, democracy and the people's vote, and you look at this in the Papua New Guinean context, is absolutely critical. There's some real, I think, challenges coming up ahead of 2027, and I have some really, really strong concerns in what sort of fair voice do the people actually have, and what does their voice actually matter when they cast their vote.
Yeah, absolutely. You raised critical points that everyone is definitely worrying about at this time. What principles or values have consistently guided your approach to leadership in high stakes environments like law enforcement and regulatory work?
Yeah, look, I really love this question. It's values for any of those who have met me would know it resonates very high with me in terms of you've got to understand yourself and have a really introspective focus on what drives you and how do you make decisions. Easy decisions are easy, but tough decisions are really, really tough. One of the toughest decisions that most of us will ever face is when we're faced with an integrity question around, well, what's the right thing to do here? How do I actually act? Do I call this out? Do I speak out? Do I act on it? And what do I try to deliver? For me, transparency, integrity, and accountability are probably the 3 values that I always talk about. For me, any decision that I absolutely find tough or challenging, or even things if I've made a decision, I haven't gone through that process and I'm not happy with the outcome, I'll step back and I'll go through those 3 values and say, well, how does that align with who I am and how I make that decision? Did I act transparently? Did I have integrity? And was I accountable? It's not always about making others accountable, as you sometimes can feel like you're doing in anti-corruption roles, but you're accountable too. Ultimately, you cannot have any person in any government system that is completely unaccountable. No one must be immune. Whilst even being the Deputy Commissioner of ICAC, whilst I have certain immunities and privileges, which are quite often swept away anyway, regardless, it doesn't matter. I've still got to act according to the law and I've got to do so in good faith. And that's absolutely critical in understanding the law behind a position like, being a member of the Independent Commission Against Corruption, that you always must act in good faith and not break the law. And if you do both of those things, I'm as equally subject to the law on Papua New Guinea as anyone else. The fourth value, which probably people find a little bit hard with me because I'm quite verbose and do talk a lot, is humility. But it's not humility in the sense of sitting meekly and quietly in the corner of the room and saying nothing. Humility is about making your decisions that they're not in my interests, they're the interests in a greater good. And in the instance of working in Papua New Guinea, it's about the people. It's about bringing real change. And sometimes what humility means, you've actually got to make a decision which will be at your own personal expense, that will cost you through either to violence, threats of harm, threats of destruction to your reputation, even financial cost in terms of fighting these type of fights can be quite high personally. But you've got to do that regardless, because for me personally, if I don't align to those values and if I can't look myself in the mirror each morning and be happy with what I see back in terms of a person with integrity, then there's really no point.
Well said. Well said. That humbled me. So thank you. We're moving on to our next question now. You have conducted sensitive internal investigations within law enforcement itself, and at WorkSafe Victoria, your role involved holding both major corporations and some of the most powerful unions in Australia to account. What did these experiences teach you about institutional culture, pressure, and the real test of integrity?
When you look at other institutions, well, first of all, I think the most important thing is you've got to look at your own organisation. What drives and defines your culture, and any sort of leadership role? Well, at every part of an organisation, we're all equally responsible for the culture, and we've got to have a positive, fair culture. And it's got to be mission based and values driven. I think that's absolutely critical that you define those things, because when you have a really clear vision that's a shared vision across the organisation, you'll get far better outcomes. Equally so, quite often looking at major corporations or other government bodies, or in the case of WorkSafe, also with unions as well too, you've really got to look at what do they stand for, what are their values and culture, and what drives them. In the sense of WorkSafe, like having the shared value of worker safety with the unions was actually quite critical, because you could really align your purpose with their purpose a lot of the time. But at the same time too, you've got to be really conscious around the fact that, part of, even a trade union is negotiating better financial outcomes for their members. And in my role at WorkSafe, that's no business of mine. I've still got to make sure that they're doing their safety role, making sure that their members are safe, but more importantly, also making the businesses and that employ workers, small, medium, large, all have the same obligations around providing that safe work environment for people. One of the big areas of that is also psychosocial harm. So basically things like workplace bullying and intimidation. You see it in Papua New Guinea, and the culture of fear that exists in the public service and most organisations of don't stick your head up, don't challenge poor behaviour, because you'll be absolutely suffer the consequences and probably lose your job. That's really challenging. And so I look at that, and how do you actually work with, government departments, work with politicians and MPs to actually get them to soften their voice in the way in which they deal with these matters, to be open to accountability and actually embrace it. I think we're a really long way off it. So, it's a real nuanced difference. Well, it's actually not even that nuance. It's completely absent in Papua New Guinea that, we have this absolute fear, which is perpetuated across all organisations, that if you speak out against corruption, you're going to suffer the consequences.
Yeah, very true. Can you share a case or moment in your career that reaffirmed your belief in the importance of integrity-based leadership?
Yeah, for me, look, I've had probably one example that really comes to mind, and it stuck with me just because of the work of a really, it was a young copper at the time. We still talk to this day. He was faced at a situation at a police station where he was provided the opportunity. Well, I say opportunity, but really they tried to indoctrinate him into corrupt behaviour. So there was a group of police members who were basically robbing people. And so they'd do so under the guise of that they were enforcing the law. But what they would do is they would target people like drug dealers, drug users, and they would steal their money, and they'd steal their drugs. And look, some of it, while not on necessarily on a commercial scale at all times, there was, sizable amounts of methamphetamine and other drugs taken, along with cash as well too. This really brave young police member reached out through an intermediary and came into contact with myself in a covert area where I was working at the time. So I worked with him, managed him through a really, really prolonged period of time where he was still having to interact with these police members and standing up for what was right. And it's tough. He had, 3 or 4 guys who were really, really senior to him, had been really, really far more experienced in what they were doing in a policing sense. But also what they were doing was basically, they were very experienced at being crooks, and they were crooks in a blue uniform. And so the courage that he took in standing up for that was absolutely massive. And we went through a period of time where, as you often do, you spend a lot of time working out, well, how can we get the evidence on this matter, but not incriminate or cause harm to our person who's been a brave whistleblower and coming forward? And we managed to achieve all of that, even to the point that I had to have some really, really strong discussions with others leading the actual overt investigation to say, what are we doing here? Because they were wanting to bring it to a halt. And I said to them, do we really think they're not doing what they say they're doing? Because all signs point to this. And we just had to gather the evidence. And that's what it really takes. It's that persistency, and people talk about it being resilience, but it's beyond resilience. It's having a resolve. It's having this internal resolve as a leader that this is the outcome we need to deliver, making sure that you'll do all the things in accordance with the law and integrity to actually get there. And as a result of that, we ended up sending a lot of police to jail, which was a really can be a negative outcome for the organisation, and it damages trust with the community in Victoria. But it also in other ways reaffirms a trust in the community that we will actually make our people accountable and that we don't tolerate it. I was extremely, extremely proud when this young police officer, and I still can't name him, won't name him to this date, but he actually received the highest award in Victoria Police called the Chief Commissioner Certificate. So he's actually given that award for his brave work and what he did. And so I was very, very proud. Not that it's all about getting pats on the back and awards, because he actually did this, for the good of the organisation. And to this day, he's a very, very, proud crime fighter who's out there targeting major criminals, working on drug importations and other organised crime type matters. So for me, that's absolutely huge. But it shows that took years, and it's now 15 odd years since that actually happened. But that's what the resolve's about. You've got to stay the course. And so even at your darkest hour in these things where you think we're not going to have a win, you don't give up. And that's what really defines me, is I won't go away.
Happy to hear that, Dan. Happy to hear that. Prime Minister Marape recently issued a public statement clarifying that the Commission remains operational under caretaker leadership, while an internal inquiry into its 3 senior commissioners, yourself included, is underway. He attributed the situation to the internal conflict within ICAC's leadership, saying that instead of working together to fight corruption, the commissioners were fighting amongst themselves. How do you respond to this claim, and what would you like the public to understand about the events that led to the current inquiry?
Look, for me, Laura, that's really disappointing. When I first, and I did read that media statement from the Prime Minister, I actually consider it quite slanderous and defamatory to myself personally. But where it's really disappointing is it's an absolute failure of leadership of the Prime Minister on his part. So whilst I won't go into the nuts and bolts of the whole situation, but approximately 18 months ago, maybe a bit less than that, my fellow Commissioner and I, Graham Gill, fellow Deputy Commissioner, along with some of our senior staff, absolutely identified what we believe is corrupt conduct on the part of Commissioner Andrew Forbes. Me personally, I uncovered some of the evidence of this behaviour. We immediately sat together as the 2 Deputy Commissioners, and we discussed the issues and thought, well, what's the right way forward here? We were in contact with the RPNGC, having conversations with them around, what does this look like? How do we broach this? What's the most appropriate way to deal with this matter? And this is one of the critical things, is decisions you make, and integrity decisions in leadership roles are so, so crucial. So obviously what we're bound to do, and I say this, and this is important to note, we are absolutely obliged to do under the ICAC, under our legislation for the ICAC, is we must report the conduct. And so we did that. So Graham and Gill and I hand-delivered to the Prime Minister not only the report from ourselves, but also the report from 3 of our senior ICAC officers at the time on the Commissioner's actions. You could visibly see on the Prime Minister how disturbed he was when we delivered this to him, and how much anxiety and stress it actually caused. This was on about, I think, the 1st of July last year. Unfortunately, the mistake I made is I sort of took my Australian view of this. In a public service where you've got proper governance and people who have reputations to protect, but also have integrity, what you do, and I've actually been in this position before when I've been challenged and had accusations made against me, you step aside. You actually take the break, and either you do it personally, which I've done in the past, where I say, you know what, take your time, look through all these things, consider the issues, and come back to me with the outcome. Ultimately, in the matters in which I went through, I was cleared. What the Prime Minister did is, we think, really just kick the can down the road. He is also duty bound to do certain things as well too. And even from a point of view, as the head of state, or sorry, as the Prime Minister of the country, what is it you actually stand for? So we expected that, Commissioner Forbes would be stood down, either formally or informally, through the lawful processes that are open to the Appointments Committee of the ICAC, or when we actually went to him, and we did this because we're transparent people, is we actually wrote to him and had a brief outline of what the matters and concerns were. I made the assumption, and so did Graham Gill, that we thought he would act with some sort of integrity and seek to take time away from the role and just let the investigation play out, and then, remove himself from decision-making. Unfortunately, what happened was the Prime Minister did none of that. Andrew, unfortunately, chose to then give all sorts of unlawful directions that would sought to shut the investigation down, telling us to stop, giving us directions as fellow commissioners to say, you can't do this, demanding the return of evidence to him, all sorts of things. And then ultimately what he then did is he launched a civil process at the courts. I can't discuss the details of that because I think there's some question in terms of where those orders are currently at. But even now, those orders we say are defunct, and there's nothing to stop action in this matter, to the point that there's an active arrest warrant against Andrew Forbes. But unfortunately, we just don't see anyone with the courage to actually act on this. I'm quite open in saying, well, Prime Minister, it's there. This exists. He's known for some time that this arrest warrant exists, and there hasn't been action. So the way this got pitched back from Andrew was that he then turned and made complaints against myself. He went and sourced false and malicious material from my ex-wife in Australia, along with other sources of evidence which were just completely false and rubbish, of which matters he knew about these things, months and months before this event happened. I'd actually disclosed him personally, saying, here's my personal situation, because I'm completely transparent. Say, I told her how it was. And I have to be careful when I talk about this matter, because there are certain laws in Australia which also prevent me from talking about the matter with my ex-wife and my family. But that was a really challenging personal thing for me, and it was extremely disappointing that was then weaponised against me to try and besmirch my character. I can't go into details of who and how, but there are many out there, and some in the legal fraternity and the public service, who perpetuated all sorts of rumours against me as well too. And I just think it's absolutely disgusting. So here we are still now, where, we're suspended on a complaint for which Graham and I, not once have we had any communication detailing what the allegations were to us from the Appointments Committee or the Prime Minister, that there was an investigation into us to establish if there was sufficient material. The first we hear of this is around about, I think it was the 20th of June or July this year. We were given a suspension notice from the Chief Secretary, telling us that the Appointments Committee had made a decision to suspend all three of us. For me, I was absolutely astounded. The fact that we had a suspension notice that listed both Graham Gill and I on the form with Andrew, who was the person who he blew the whistle on. It was absolutely astounding. I've never seen anything like it, that you would put the whistleblower or the complainant in a matter and suspend him under the same process under which the person who was the subject of the complaint. And for what there's a litany of evidence against Andrew, for some reason, I don't know what they manufactured, but apparently they've said they've made a lawful decision. So I have some really, really deep concerns around that decision to the Appointments Committee, given that whilst I can't validate that they're actually accurate, I have been supplied copies of paperwork by whistleblowers who have shown me that only the PM and the supposed leader of the opposition, Mr. Douglas Tomasea, with only two had signed this meeting form, which for me, first of all, not a quorum of the Appointments Committee. I also note, and this is not me getting into politics because it's not my role to play, but I note the recent commentary from the Honourable James Namani, who's obviously challenging at the moment the actual leadership of Mr. Tomasea before the Supreme Court. So for me, there's concerns for me. Well, was it Mr. Tomasea in correct standing? I'll choose not to go into other rumours and innuendo here around that situation, but people are making allegations to me around that process and what happened. But for me, the absolute key part of this is there's been absolutely no natural justice. There's no law that supports this. that they've completely broken the law. I'm a constitutional officer, and they've done the one thing they're not supposed to do, is run your constitutional officers out of town who are standing up against corruption. I'm not surprised because it's Papua New Guinea, but I still find it beguiling, I think, in that global context of this is just not how you do business. So, yeah, it's really concerning. And this notion around infighting, it's absolute rubbish. It's like I've managed people and worked as collaborative leadership and boards, working in senior leadership roles in Victoria Police. You always have professional disagreements. I would worry about any organisation where all the senior leaders agree on every time. What there is at the ICAC and in the law, there's a really simple process. You've got a commission of 3, your former commission, 2 votes of the commission, carry a motion or carry a decision. It's really, really simple. So how is there infighting? Graham and I can't recall a decision where Graham and I weren't aligned on, but just because someone doesn't like a decision doesn't make it infighting. And who is the Prime Minister as someone who can be subject to the authority of the ICAC, along with the other members of the Appointments Committee, to make such decisions? I find it, and I've seen no detail of what is the infighting, what are we supposedly disputing over, what's the challenges, and I hear all sorts of offensive terms like, oh, it's just alphas being alphas and things like this, and the garbage that gets put out about there. And all this does is just minimise a really, really serious allegation, a really, really serious matter, which should be before the criminal court in Papua New Guinea for them to be the decision maker. And all I've seen to date is a whole lot of people trying to avoid accountability before the courts and before the people of PNG. And to me, that's absolutely disturbing, and I just won't stand for it.
Well, we certainly didn't know all that. Thank you for sharing that, Dan. Do you believe that the government has interfered in the work of the Commission, directly or indirectly? And if so, in what ways?
For me, one of the greatest things that initially dawned on me was the absolute failure to report to the ICAC or provide material to the ICAC as well too. And this again gets, couched in that sort of view that the public service and even senior leaders in the public service, lack sometimes confidence, understanding what their roles and responsibilities are. And that may well be true. But when I use my powers to issue notices to provision of material from certain departments, and these are departments where it's absolutely critical, I expect them to be answered. If I'm asking for financial documents, well, private industry can do it. The banks we had no issue with for the most part. They were really, really cooperative in providing us financial details, no issue whatsoever. But it's only the government agencies that give us pushback. Furthered as well too, you just got to look at some of the stuff that's been reported public in the media. We had a court decision on a sitting MP and minister in a civil court finding that he interfered in an electoral process through the payment of alleged payment of bribes. And what do we get from that? Nothing. It astounds me. It absolutely astounds me. And so they're things that we then seek to progress as a ICAC, but then you get stifled at every turn. We'd ask the police for matters, give us a copy of this matter, because I've got really, really strong concerns around allegations that are being made around an important person who's supposed to be part of the fight against money laundering. But for some reason, I can't get a hold of the material from the police. It's like, well, what are you doing? You were challenged at the courts. You actually had an order against you to say you can't execute that warrant on this entity. You actually won that. So it's what took you, a while to win it. You eventually, you did. So why have you not gone and got that material yet and progressed that investigation? It just makes no sense to me.
My golly.
I even hark it back to, you look at things like Task Force Sweep, where that was ultimately disbanded some years ago. What people forget, there was actually a court challenge to that. And it went on for years. And I'm led to believe that it was ultimately withdrawn in 2017 by a senior leader in that task force sweep. And so why would you pull that? You actually had the win. You actually had, there in your hand, the right to go and re-establish that task force and get the work done. So, and for me, this is what comes down to that resolve is I think I have a different level of resolve, and that's what I tried to instill in a lot of our ICAC people. Unfortunately, though, some of those people with really, really great and strong resolve just left. They left the organisation because of the fact of what was going on with Andrew and have now gone back to Australia. And these people were key deliverers in our legal frameworks and what we're doing in our prosecution sense. It absolutely started to build a really, really strong independent organisation, and we're doing everything to protect that. We saw it on another side of our business, in prevention and corporate side of the business. One of our key staff left. They were absolutely critical in putting together, all the funding work we're doing with UNODC, the Australian High Commission and the Australian government to ensure some really, really critical programs and work for support. in a space where we were absolutely being, cash strapped, not paid our budget by the government. We'd make submissions around what the budget was that we actually required. We wouldn't pad it. And then we'd get probably promised maybe, 4/5 of that. And then at the 4/5, we were lucky to get a third of that again. And so we're forever chasing money. We're trying to bring people in internationally as well too, who have the absolute expertise in fighting corruption and have the skill sets we need to investigate financial crime. And we're getting bled dry to do this. And I'd put submissions up to government saying, if we actually introduce, a proper money laundering and proceeds of crime legislative reform and implement the money laundering task force and the money laundering operations committee, which I put proposals, and they Prime Minister's publicly spoken on it and said, we've got this is happening. It's like, well, no, it doesn't, because you haven't given any of the political will and support to do any of these things. And something like that is actually cost neutral eventually. And if anything, it turns a profit, because what it does, it actually pulls back your wealth to Papua New Guinea. I started floating the concept of and developing a concept around working with what's called a special purpose vehicle, where we could actually launch civil claims in international jurisdictions, not subject to the rigmarole of relying on international partners and other governments to support us in doing that. So we could do that ourselves if we funded it privately, of which there's actually firms out there which will finance these things for you. Absolute resistance to it. Because why would we not go and seek to try and return some of the billions of kina that's sitting in Singapore and Australia? Some of the real estate holdings and the fancy cars that people have in Australia, it's an obscenity. So where's the appetite is what I say. There is none.
Oh, it's heating up, Dan. Without going into anything that may be before the courts or legally restricted, do you believe you will be reinstated to continue the work you have started? And what is at stake for PNG's anti-corruption fight if you are not?
I don't believe I will be. No. I really think that there's a really strong push at all levels to get us out and keep us out. So for me, that's really disappointing, but I think it's more so really disappointing for the people. I think that, Graham, but particularly myself, I've shown that, I'll talk publicly. I just don't care. While I don't encourage it, I've said previous times before, you'll have to kill me to stop me. So, whether I do this in my constitutional role or whether I do it independently, I think transparency is absolutely key around this. I have really, really strong concerns. Like I saw when we were forced to, for technical reasons, withdraw a court challenge to our removal via the suspension, which we are refiling. The Solicitor General out and makes a statement in a national paper, giving us basically warning us not to speak and not the media to report these things. That's an obscenity, but it's just not your role, to try and, even if it's unintentional, to leave the inference around to say that you can't talk, as the two deputy commissioners of the ICAC, although suspended, and clearly have some really strong insight and knowledge into these matters. That's really, really damaging. I see, even I think the interim commissioner, Mr. Thomas Elu, and I know Thomas, I actually think he's a person who does have his heart in the right place. But he talks of an investigation with the Sports Foundation where he went and briefed relevant ministers first. For me, that's an obscenity. Like, never, ever, ever would you do such a thing if there's any risk around the fact that they may in some way be connected to that matter or have got politically something to lose. Because, you're here to work collaboratively with many, many people and make friends. You've really got to be prepared that if the point comes, you've got to cut friends off. And that's just the nature of the work that you do. Right. So I just think it's crazy. But I really know, and I'm well aware, there's definitely a groundswell out there from government to try and silence us and trying to get us out. And I don't think any of us are naive enough to not think that deals aren't done in the background that may allow others to escape the grasp of organisations like the ICAC. It's even simple things like the fact we don't have a proper beneficial ownership or proper transparency around what politicians actually earn, what their wealth actually is, what businesses they're directors of. It's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. Like you look at places like Australia, and I'm not saying Australia is perfect in its governance of politicians and they're all completely rosy. But, I'm quite sure you can log on to various websites that will tell you exactly what the Prime Minister owns, what interests he has, and what he earns. Where in PNG would you have that? I can't think of it. The amount of politicians I've heard that have told me that they all made their money before they got into politics, I just start laughing. I just don't think it's true.
Yeah, neither do I. Oh, yeah. Wouldn't that be amazing if they actually published what they owned and what
Yep.
money they made before they went into elections to
Yep.
even be a candidate to start off with? That would be wonderful.
Well, going back to the Prime Minister's statements that he's made in the media, I mean, there was some time ago, there was an investigation team which was announced comprising of the Secretary to the NEC, the Secretary of the NJSS, National Judicial Staff Service, and the State Solicitor. Went and met with them transparently. I recorded the whole meeting. They let me do that. They recorded the meeting with me as well too. Told them everything, completely open and transparent. You know, that was announced through the papers. I saw that in the media before I was notified of it. Like it's in it. I got more, even the Prime Minister's most recent statement, which you mentioned before, that's more information, probably about 20 times over than what I've been given. I hear nothing. We hear absolutely nothing. And that's the intent. It's just to create this veneer to the public that, you know, somehow the deputy commissioners are bad. And we've dealt with it effectively. And, you know, the ICAC is still chugging along and going. Well, it's not. That's just not right. I just really hear, and I'm pretty confident there's not much happening there at all. To the point, I don't even know, you know, I was hearing weeks ago that even my replacement wasn't cited for the first 3 or 4 weeks that is supposedly taken over my role in operations. Who's driving the
Wow.
work?
Yeah. Good. That exactly. Who is driving the work? Leads me to my next question. What is the current status of ICAC PNG in terms of operational capacity, investigations underway, and public engagement?
Look, to be honest, and this is challenging for more because I don't want to betray confidences of those who are within the organisation that still talk to me. I don't think it's great. We definitely lost a lot of our leadership talent. So out of 4 executive directors that we had in place, look, 3 were expats from Australia, and I have no shame in that because the legislation for the ICAC is actually really clear about the ability that we can hire anyone and under the terms that we think appropriate. Which is absolutely critical because that's just what it needs. You need that freedom in an independent organisation to really fight corruption and bring in the skill set. Because the reality is, this never existed in PNG beforehand. Now, I referenced sweep before. What are the actual results of sweep? We talk about it with some sort of great mythology, but what changed in the last 10 years? Since sweep folded, has things gotten better or worse in corruption? They've gotten worse. And so we lost 3 executive directors out of 4. The only executive director that stayed was a Papua New Guinea national who does do fine work for the ICAC. But again, you know, I think it's very much a thing in Australia that you will walk away from a position on the basis of maintaining your integrity. That's just not an option for people in Papua New Guinea. You need to feed your family. And so I hold no judgment for anyone who's done anything at the ICAC to keep their job. But what we lost a heap of capacity. We were in the process of even recruiting for our executive director to head up our operations area because we greatly needed that international assistance again in terms of investigations because it doesn't exist that didn't exist in the ICAC. It doesn't exist in places like the Ombudsman's Commission or the PNG. They just don't have those investigative techniques. I do acknowledge there is a superintendent, Glenn Lewis, who's come from Australia, from the Australian Federal Police, and I think that is a positive step for the NFACD at the RPNGC, but it's just not enough. I mean, we're underway. I was putting together a team around bringing in international investigation consultants who are going to employ under short-term contracts of around about 12 months and up, just to bring in, uplift, work alongside our investigation teams in Papua New Guinea to actually fight corruption, to uplift and leave a skill set. And that's the critical bit. I love PNG and I think, you know, there's a lot of beautiful things about the country. There's a lot of terrible things when you drive the streets of Port Moresby and see the poverty. But it was never for the rest of my life thing. I'm limited to 2 terms. I'm pretty much most of the way through my first one. Probably not going to get invited back for my second one. But I didn't want to be there forever. It was just to leave enough in place that the people coming up through our organisation were ready to take on those type of roles so that the next, maybe not the next ones, but the ones after that, commissioners would be from Papua New Guinea, that they came to the role with no baggage, no cloud over them, no political alignment, and would do the job fairly and freely. That just simply hasn't happened. And things have just gotten worse. We were trying to get into our new premises because we were shut in a very, very small office in the central government office there. Poor security, poor information security, absolute risk to the organisation, very, very easily compromised. We were moving across the road to a new building where we'd had the whole floor and part of the ground floor. And that was going to take on about 60 employees all up, plus any other independent consultants we bring on board. That just hasn't happened. I'd estimate the ICAC staffing would be at around about probably 60 people at the moment. And that's a requirement of the FATF and the Mutual Evaluation Report is asked for the ICAC needs to be fully operationalised. The Operations Committee for Money Laundering was supposed to be operationalised, and I was doing that. That had happened. The Money Laundering Task Force. That was literally happening the Monday that I was forced out of the country under threat of arrest.
Wow. To hear that you actually had plans like that, had me excited, and I'm sure the public would be excited to hear that. And then to know now that that's not eventuated is very sad.
Look, it goes beyond plans, Laura. It was happening. It was actually happening. I'd assigned the people. It had happened. I was trying to recruit people into those roles. I was bringing in support from other agencies. I must say, I must give credit to the newly forming NSAs, the National Security Agency, and the National Intelligence Organisation, who were also really big supporters of that as well too, in trying to build that effectiveness. I think that's, whilst I'm critical here, I still need to pay a mind to those who are supporting some of those initiatives, because it shouldn't be all doom and gloom. But it just hasn't happened as a result, us being forced out.
Sorry to hear that. Very sorry to hear that. Because the public is tired of seeing anti-corruption bodies that ultimately fail to prosecute corrupt officials. How is ICAC different, both in its structure and legal powers, and how does it intend to stop the scourge of corruption in a meaningful way?
Yeah. Look, the Constitution is there. I mean, it's been since 2014. I think the original amendment to the Constitution at 220B was made onwards. That's absolutely critical, because what it's supposed to do, it's supposed to give the ICAC commissioners a protection, and it's protection of the independence of those three. And it's not saying the ICAC as individuals, it's saying them as a commission, as a body. The three commissioners make up the commission is the ICAC. And that's absolutely critical. What we saw, though, is a willingness to absolutely act outside that. And again, I'm not going to re-prosecute the matter with Andrew that we've already talked about. But we also see the government take advantage of that as well too. They're not meeting their responsibilities. They weren't meeting their responsibilities in terms of proper funding and proper support. And proper support, as is a requirement under the Constitution, goes beyond just giving us the financial funding to do the things we need to do. You should be verbally supporting them, not just claiming it as a win. You would never hear me talk about, and you hear it from many other public departments, I would never say we thank the Marape Rosso government. That's not my role. But we're an equal access organisation. We should talk to anyone and everyone in politics. If they knock on our door and want to chat, more than happy to talk to them. I do know one or two politicians, one in particular who was quite vocal all the time around sack the commissioners. We're not here to be your political issue. But at the same time too, and I put this out through other channels, if he wants to call me, pick up the phone and talk to me. People will give you my number. I'll chat to you about it. I'll tell you where we're at. There is, in many ways, whilst we need to restrict access to confidential information and not tell politicians if we're investigating them, I'll provide equal access. I'll talk to them. I'll tell them what they need to do and what I recommend their voice should be. I'll give it to them honestly, and correct them when they're wrong in what they say. And there have been some that have been very, very wrong. And that for me is really disturbing and disappointing. And that's not just on the government side, that's on both sides of politics.
Dear. How do you balance the public's right to be informed about ICAC's work, especially in high-stakes cases, with the legal need to protect the integrity of the investigation and the confidentiality of those under scrutiny?
Yeah, it's interesting, that one. Like if you read through the ICAC itself, there's a lot of, I call them trapdoors, but they're trapdoors for the corrupt. So there's ways in which the Prime Minister can make directions if we issue our powers or use our powers. The Prime Minister says it's going to harm international relationships or calls it terrorism. And this is a go-to for politicians, is to call something terrorism, and then it brings in all sorts of really, really strong legislation powers. The PM essentially could shut down the use of my powers. So I could demand certain bits of material through the use of a Section 58 notice, for instance, and the PM could then turn around and say, if some of that, no, that's for national security or that's going to harm international relationships, we're stopping that. The other trapdoors are things where they talk about, you can't say things that are vexatious or harmful. It's like, well, were there not enough protection in PNG? Can't people, if they're defamed, or have things said about them, as I'll be doing, are progressing those matters through the civil courts for the defamation that's occurred against me and the harm to my reputation caused I say by the Prime Minister is what my allegation is, and his perpetuation of what happened, and his absolute failure to act. Politicians, if I say something bad about you, sue me, fight me in the court, and my defence will be the balance, will be reasonable truth. Because I'm really, really careful in what I say, that if there's a fair chance I've said something, and I haven't named anyone specifically, in regards to a corruption allegation during this conversation, but if I was to, there's a fair chance I've got enough for a prima facie suspicion to warrant the fact that we're investigating you. And then, if possibly further, enough evidence that you're getting very, very close to potentially being charged. So I'd invite you, if you want to sue us, sue us. And, unfortunately, what that does do, it can actually bring out a lot of the material which is can impact the integrity of an investigation, but it needs to be there. And the reality is here in PNG, the place leaks like a sieve. I get things like NEC papers and decisions sent to me through people because they're not happy with it. Other documents which are supposed to should be like rated as things like in confidence or top secret or secret, they get distributed to me from all departments and agencies. And I completely encourage that from whistleblowers, because you should be protected. If you're calling for transparency and you provide material, you should be respected. To the point I've even set up an email, a Proton mail address, so it's encrypted. So it's in integrity in PNG at proton.me. So people want to send me stuff. I'm more than happy to receive it, start the conversation. But the thing I do ask with people is when you do supply information, make sure it is actually evidence. The most important thing is having documentary proof and evidence of all these things. It's absolutely critical, because that's the thing you need if you do face defamation. That's critical. I look at things, when I first heard the term cybercrime in PNG, I thought, oh, wow, that's pretty good. They're pretty forward, moving in terms of they've got laws which protect them from hacking and other bits and pieces. Then I realised people were using things like cybercrime to punch down on people. So saying someone published something on you on Facebook, and then because they don't have the means to fight it, you find yourself at the will of the police, who are quite often potentially driven by the person who has an agenda has paid them to go and do it for them. It's simply outrageous. I look at it in terms of even things where people talk about pornography as a cybercrime as well too. So we get people, who distribute images amongst themselves, who might be a couple, might be having even might be having an affair. Hey, that's wrong. That's a moral judgment. But the fact we see where that type of legislation gets weaponized against people, they find themselves in court and they're getting prison because they sent an image of themselves to a partner and someone got hold of it. There's laws in places like Australia that are the absolute contrary to that. If you publish that sort of material against someone or private material, you're going to prison, or getting charged. You're not the person who the material's on. It's legislation which absolutely punches down. And the latest terrorism bill, the fact that the police commissioner, on his own authority, can use electronic surveillance, and thank God I don't believe that the RPNGC actually had the technology to intercept phones or do listening devices yet, in the sense of what would happen here in Australia. But they can still leave what's called a throwdown listening device, which is a recording device which is hidden, and record conversations. And they can do that, a private conversation, on the authority of the police commissioner. And all that tape, if you say something bad that can be considered as a terrorist act or a terrorist threat, you might be critical of the government. You might go and spray paint a slogan on the parliament. Absolutely the wrong thing to do. That's not what a parliament is for. It should be respected. But if you do, you're a terrorist. It's crazy, that stuff.
Wow. I learned something new. I didn't know that.
It is absolutely against transparency. Used in the right way, such laws, and I'm, from someone who worked in law enforcement for many, 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 many decades and used all of those techniques like listening devices, optical cameras, surveillance devices, executing covert search warrants, we could go in and search a person's house. Guess what they're all done with? An order of the court. That's what what having balances and then checks and accountability is about. There is none of that.
Who's going to take that to court first, and when would a judgment be made? These things will sit there forever.
How do you challenge such things? I mean, even when you see that, decisions of NEC are non-justiciable, you can't challenge, let alone disclose a decision from NEC or find out, through a transparent mean to say, well, what happened at NEC meeting? Have I had my rights breached as a citizen? You can't do anything against it. NEC can make a choice, and you can't appeal it. You're not supposed to be able to take it to a court. So, what else can they strip from you?